We don't have to read too far in the story before we discover the second test of Abraham's faith. This time the issue is security. Will God protect him and his loved ones? Apparently Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has a godlike status. He's a ruthless horror of a man. If he sees a woman he wants, he takes her where he wants, when he wants, from whoever he wants. Pharaoh's reputation in this regard is so troubling that Abram fears for his own life as he takes Sarah to Egypt. So he comes up with a plan, and Sarah agrees. They pretend to be brother and sister so that Pharaoh won't kill Abram. So Abram, who didn't believe that God would provide, now doesn't believe that God will protect. He's failed the second test too. Remember, by the way, God's promise to bless the whole earth through Abram's descendants. How's that going to work if God allows Abraham or his wife Sarah to come to harm? Abram simply doesn't believe anything much that God has told him. He could have derailed the whole project God had involved him in before it had even properly started. He's a disaster. My theology teacher, Dr. Packer, he talks about Abraham at this point, and he says that he was capable of repeatedly shabby deceptions, which actually endangered his wife. He was by nature a man of little moral courage, altogether too anxious about his own security. It's depressing. He's a failure. Folks, before we're too hard on Abram, let's take a look in the mirror. Just how strong is our faith? To what extent are we trusting God these days? Oh, but we say, I have trusted Jesus. When I was X years old, I heard the gospel, I prayed the prayer, and I trusted Jesus to save me from my sins and to win me a place in heaven. I've done what Abraham did. At the start of chapter 12, I've left the world and I've set off on my journey with Jesus. For many of us, I hope for all of us, that's true. But it's equally true that for many of us, we're not trusting Jesus now. Not really. Not with the real stuff of life. We're not trusting him to provide for us and our children. That's why we overwork and overcommit ourselves financially, because we believe it's down to us to provide our kids with a good life. We're not trusting him for our protection. It's our concern for our kids and for our loved ones and ourselves that often extends beyond a healthy awareness of risk and responsibility into a paranoid form of helicopter parenting. We believe that we and not God are the ones who finally keep our kids from all harm. When it comes to how we live our lives, we educate ourselves to the max, we curate a perfect CV to death, all to ensure that we can choose every path for ourselves in life. And we do all of these things so that we can avoid, at all costs, actually having to trust God for anything. We say we're trusting God, but we're not. We say we live by faith, but we don't. Not yet. Like Abram, most of the time, most of us are failing the faith test. We've seen Abram's lack of faith right at the start of this story, and it's deflating, it's disappointing. Where do we go from here? What, if anything, can we learn from this part in the story? How in particular can we continue to call this man the father of the faithful, as Paul did in his letter to Rome or to Galatia? How can we call this guy faithful? Well, it's not by saying that he has a strong faith. He clearly doesn't. It's not by saying that he's good at trusting or faithing. He clearly isn't. The only thing that we can really say about faith in this story is that it seems to depend not so much on the quality of the faith expressed or exercised, so much as the quality of the one in whom that faith is placed. Abram's faith has substance not because of how well he's trusting, but because of the utter faithfulness of the one he's trusting in. Folks, it's on that basis and that basis alone that any one of us could ever be described as having faith in God. You see, we're like Abram. We fail our faith tests all the time. But this episode of faltering faith, and other episodes we'll come to soon enough, we'll see that Abram really does blaze the trail. He really is the father of the faithful, the failing faithful. The rest of the Bible is full of the failing faithful. Church history is full from cover to cover of the failing faithful. You and I today, if we have accepted Jesus, are the latest in a long line of the failing faithful. But don't worry about that. Paul tells Timothy in his second letter, even if we're faithless, he will remain faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Our ongoing relationship with God doesn't depend on our faithfulness. It depends on his. Isn't that just brilliant? I love that. I'd like to wrap things up this morning by putting all of this incident, Abram's failing faith, back into a broader biblical context. You may know that the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which tell the story of human beginnings before the time of Abraham, that those chapters follow a repeated pattern. Human sin is followed by God's judgment and then by God's grace. And that cycle turns. So Adam and Eve go through the cycle. Cain goes through the cycle. Noah goes through the cycle. The pattern's repeated over and over, except when we get to the last cycle. We thought about it last week. The Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. Old Testament scholar Gerhard von Rath spotted how this story seems incomplete in light of all that's gone before. He says, the story of the Tower of Babel concludes with God's judgment on humankind. There is no word of grace. The whole story so far seems to break off in shrill dissonance. And the question now arises even more urgently. Is God's relationship to humans now finally broken? Is God's gracious forbearance now exhausted? Has God rejected humanity in wrath forever? Do you see what he's saying? The story so far has been one of yes, sin, yes, judgment, but always grace. And halfway through chapter 11 of Genesis, we're left wondering, has God's grace run out? The answer, in the second half of Genesis 11, comes in the form of a family tree, from Terah to Abraham. It comes in the form of God's blessing to Abram. I will bless you. All the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. Folks, God's grace is at work once more in a newer and a bigger way, and it won't be thwarted. Not by the hubris of Babel, and not by Abram's failing faith. God's grace will work relentlessly through Abraham and his failing family, until one day a man is born, one man whose faith won't fail. One who trusts in God, Jesus Christ, God's faithful Son. through his saving work on the cross, through the spreading of the gospel by his followers, God's great blessing promised to Abraham really is going to reach the whole world. Folks, Abraham failed his test of faith, but his failure couldn't stop God's grace. And rest assured, neither will yours or mine.